Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of congregational humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Mickey, for some memories I'd almost forgotten about, so I really appreciate that very much. One of the things that she didn't mention, but which is a big part of my life, is that in the early 60s, I started keeping a journal. It was a personal journal, and I initially used it as a way to clarify some serious personal challenges I was having that required clarity and that was elusive and about which I wasn't really comfortable sharing with friends. Over time, I recognized that the process of daily writing also gave me a place to explore ideas and troubleshoot and make a few plans. When Governor Perpich asked me to be his running mate on that fateful day in June of 1982, our first conversation included an acknowledgement that we would be making history. That when we were elected, I recognized that I was making history, and as Minnesota's first woman lieutenant governor and a journal writer, I understood that I had an obligation to keep good records of the work that I would be doing. Earlier in my life, as an entrepreneur, I had been selected by Nina Archibald. Some of you know her, remember when she became the first woman deputy director of the Minnesota Historical Society, and subsequently became the first female director of the Historical Society. And I still remember that fateful phone call she made to me, and I picked up the phone not knowing who she was, and she had been on the job for a short time and realized that most of the archives collected by the Minnesota Historical Society were of white guys, and most of the white guys were in the railroad business and in the forestry business. What a surprise. And so she decided she wanted to do something about that, and she wrote a grant proposal that would give her the resources to start collecting the archives of Minnesota women. And her idea was that there would be, I'm making this up because I don't remember the details, but Nina is still around, so you can ask her that detail. But something like 6 or 8 young women, like I was at the time, seems hard to believe now, and 6 or 8 who were older, more established people like Ebba Hoffman, who at that time was running the Smead manufacturing company that her husband had started. It was the one that make the manila file folders, remember those? Yeah, the company is still run by a woman, member of that family. At any rate, Nina called and said that she wanted me to be one of those women, and she would send somebody over to educate our little staff of 3 or 4 people about how to keep our records so they would be appropriate for the archives. So we did, and it was a mind-blowing experience for me, because even though I'd been keeping a journal, I really hadn't thought about the fact that my little business was somehow part of history as well. So I actually remember one of these scrapbooks that we gave to the Historical Society, because it was the way we kept track of our original clients, and it was so primitive, but it's there. Anyway. And it was a wonderful experience. So when I became lieutenant governor then, one of the first things I did was ask the staff to call the state archivist to come over and educate my little staff at the lieutenant governor's office about how to keep our archives in good shape so that we would have, good records of the work we were doing. So I had been thinking already when I got to that job about my journal of personal contributions to Minnesota's history. But as often is the case, life has other plans than the ones you start thinking about for yourself. In my case, my political career had an 8-year time span instead of what I had hoped to be would be a 16-year time frame. And my subsequent professional journey through positions in the federal government, a short stint in a small corporation, and then as chief executive officer of an international nonprofit organization, I really had no time or inclination for writing. Then, during the final years of my leadership role at NAFSA, Association of International Educators, my husband Peter fell down a flight of stairs, suffering a permanent brain injury that required him to live the final 9.5 years of his life in a nursing home in Sweden, altering our life as a couple, his life for sure, and mine as well. I became a caregiving spouse with continued responsibility for leading an organization. In early 2020, when I phoned my friend Pauline Boss to let her know that Peter had died Christmas before, she urged me to write the story of those last 10 years. Some of you will know Pauline Boss. She is a very special academic and leader here in Minnesota. She first articulated the concept of ambiguous loss in a path-breaking book by that name. Her second book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, has provided extraordinary guidance for thousands of families, myself included. So for several months, following that initial telephone conversation with Pauline, her voice just stayed in my head as I took long walks in those early days of following Peter's death, while also experiencing the isolation of COVID. Writing this memoir has been a special experience on very many levels. For 50 years, I had held a deep sense that I could not write, and that even though I'd kept a journal for decades, it never occurred to me that I was a writer, because there was feedback from a person, my favorite professor actually at Macalester. My first paper written for him, and the feedback came back, and it was in red pencil, as they were in those days. Maybe they still are, I don't know. But at any rate, it was in red, and the letters were large, and it felt really loud, and they were harsh. And I absorbed that feedback as though it was the truth. It did not occur to me to fight back. I do not understand that now. I mean, the person I am today, I don't understand how I could actually absorb that and say, go on my life and say, he's telling me the truth. Nevertheless, as I endured the third month of the quiet life we'd all experienced due to COVID, I started writing. I focused initially on those final 10 years with Peter, because those were the journals I had that were the most raw, and they were there. I didn't have to look for them in another box. It included facing the reality that Peter would not return home. It included learning the reality of how to navigate my own role in this new life, how to figure out how to be an advocate for him in Sweden, where he was living. And so I had 50 pages, and I shared those pages with Pauline Boss. Her first response was, I'm writing my third book. I don't have time to do it. I'll speed read 10 pages, and I'll give you some feedback about that. So we had lunch in South Minneapolis near her home, and I got on an airplane to go back to Washington, and by the time I woke up the next morning, I had an email from Pauline that said, well, I read all 50 pages because I couldn't put it down. You're a really good writer. And I can feel, as I'm reading that, you're a really good writer and the stories are great, I can feel all that negative stuff that had been carrying around in my body for 50 years just leave. I mean, it's like I'm a different person at the end of that, reading her email to me. But then she said, the problem with what you've written is that it's not enough. In order for this to make sense to a reader, you have to write the whole story. So I said, okay. what else? It's COVID, I have nothing else to do, and now I don't feel so bad about myself, so I can actually enjoy writing, which I actually did. And I mean, I've at this point, I've listened to so many other memoir writers and read so many things, and I know that many people describe writing as a slog. I can honestly say from that moment on, writing has been a joy. I have just enjoyed it so much, and I still do. So go figure, I don't know. But I've had a few insights as I've written this book, and I have realized, which I had to do because when I first started talking to Eric Anderson, who became my editor at the University of Minnesota Press, he first said to me, "I think you have 2 books here." And I said, "Well, I'm not writing 2 books. We got to figure out a way for this to be 1 book. I think that will be a good thing for me." So of course I had to keep thinking about what are the threads here that connect some of this early entrepreneurial and political organizing to a caregiving role toward the end of this story. So there are some threads that came into focus for me. The first one is that leadership can be practiced from whatever position one is in. Early in my life, I chose the path of entrepreneurship, essentially creating a job for myself when other opportunities felt elusive, and in partnership with another woman, identified a niche for us working with nonprofit organizations, because I'd done that before and I realized that nonprofits could use the kind of service that we were talking about offering. At about the same time, I was anxious to get involved in feminist politics, but I really, I was out of the loop completely. I had not been a party activist. I was a kid, really. And I walked into a meeting of the Minnesota Women's Political Caucus just to, kind of try to get involved. And I walked out a few hours later with an assignment as the new chair of the Minnesota Women's Political Caucus. I was too naive to know that I had just walked into the den, because it was the beginning of the DFL Feminist Caucus being organized and the Republican Feminist Caucus. So there was a quiet understanding among the 2 organizations that the bipartisan effort would dissolve. But I did not know about that, and I was too naive to think that that was necessary. So I walked out with this new assignment and started more actively appreciating the value of a bipartisan feminist political effort, and moved from there. So I continued running my business at the same time, and I soon recognized in that business that life was a little too lonely, and I had I needed more skills. I was, it's not unusual that we all find we're in a job we're over our head, but in my case, I was really over my head. So I read an article one day in the St. Paul Pioneer Press about Susan Sands, who was an entrepreneur. And within 12 minutes of reading that article, I've tracked her down. Those were the days when you could actually look in a phone book and find somebody. And I don't know how you find phones anymore. But I called her, and a day later, I was sitting in her 3rd floor office in her house on Osceola Avenue in St. Paul. And we became friends, and we talked about organizing other women entrepreneurs, and then we, it went from there. We convinced this new organization in Washington called the National Association of Women Business Owners that they should change their bylaws so they could have chapters, and we would be the first chapter. And that's what happened. 12 years after starting my own business and being involved in organizing women business owners and becoming a national president of that organization, I was in a position of getting the attention of Governor Burbidge. I was candidate, and then I was lieutenant governor, a role with no authority, but lots of opportunities for influence. The leadership I exercised during those 8 years required me to observe and learn and find ways to persuade. Nobody had to listen to me. Later, as CEO of NAFSA, the Association of International Educators, I was I was where the buck stopped, and I was comfortable making decisions when the situation required that. But at the same time, I quickly understood that being effective in that role as well required building a talented team, a team that supported each other, and I had to support them as well in taking responsibility for their piece of the organization and creating an environment where all of us, every employee and every manager, was being part of the whole picture. Later still, when Peter's fall caused a life-changing brain injury, the trajectory of our life changed forever. Overnight, I was in the role of caregiving and advocacy for a person who could not do that for himself. As others have learned, maybe many in this audience have learned, I was no longer in charge of his care, yet it was up to me to ensure that he had the best possible support each day because he could not speak for himself. When he entered that nursing home, he was the youngest resident, and when he died, he was still the youngest resident. He was the only person in that, among the residents, who could not speak for himself. He couldn't speak at all, and he could make himself understood to the extent that he could disagree or not disagree very clearly, but you had to ask. So that meant that I needed to build constructive and engaging relationships with the management of the nursing home, with each nurse and nurse's aide on his ward, and with the doctor who monitored his health care. I came to understand that for me, this was a whole new way of understanding and conceptualizing leadership. A second theme in my story is that diversity of ideas, a diversity in points of view, and therefore individuals, including women and men, and individuals of a variety of cultural and racial backgrounds, is essential to a well-functioning organization and society. And that accomplishing that requires intentionality. And intentionality is critical in creating an inclusive government, an inclusive organization, a society, or even a network of friends. It's true that most of us spend our lives hanging out with people who look like us, attend the same schools, churches, or other community organizations, and if we believe that diversity of thought, cultural, and economic background or color is important, we must be intentional about making that happen in our personal lives as well as in the organizations we participate in. As I wrote this book, I realized that at every step in my own journey, I had focused on expanding the diversity of the network. From the days of starting the Women Business Owners Association, when we had to postpone our founding meeting because we didn't have enough women of color among our organizing group, to being a participant in the Perpich Johnson administration, where the governor's stated public goal was to integrate by gender and race every board and commission that he appointed, and to significantly integrate and expand the participation of diverse peoples in the judiciary, to later at NAFSA deciding or committing to having a diverse staff, but also a diverse group of interns. And that meant on the intern level alone that I said we can't have an internship program if we can't pay for it. So we have to figure out how to keep it in the budget, and you can't hire if it's not going to be a diverse group. So I wasn't very popular at the beginning of that, of course, because it's much easier to appoint people and find people who look just like you. It takes a little more effort. But if it's the only way, then people somehow figure out how to do something they thought was impossible the month before. And finally, while I wrote this book, when I was personally ready to write, the timeliness of sharing a book that includes my experiences as the first woman lieutenant governor at a time when our state and country are facing the very real possibilities of having our first woman governor and our first woman president, I've obviously thought further about how my personal experience informs my thoughts about this exciting moment in history. Fortunately, even though I wrote this book at a time when I had no idea that it would be coming out this particular month, I do address an important aspect of this in the book. Because at my very first meeting of the National Association of Lieutenant Governors, I met Martha Griffiths, who at that time was the Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, but previously she had been a member of Congress from Michigan for more than 20 years, and if she had stayed in the Congress, she would have become the first female chair of Appropriations Committee. But she chose to go home because her husband had been very sick, and at the time, in 1982, Jim Blanchard, the candidate for governor, needed a little boost, so he chose Martha as his running mate, and he said publicly more than once that he wouldn't have won that election without her. Well, Martha and I hit it off at our very first meeting and became close friends, and when she heard that I had this incredible access to the governor's time and meetings, he had said to me during our transition period that I had access to any meeting in his office anytime. I could just walk in. I could look at his schedule, and if I wanted to be at a meeting, I should just be there. It wasn't up to them, that was up to me. And so Martha said to me, you know, your number one job is to be prepared to be governor. You'll do other things, of course, but your most important job is to be ready to be governor. And since you have all this access anyway, and the governor knows what it's like to be lieutenant governor, because he had been one himself, at a time in a situation where he had no access to the governor's participation. He wanted his administration to be different. So she said to me, take notes every day. Keep your journal every day. And think about how you would do the work that he's doing. Would you do it differently? Would you do it the same? Would you make the same decisions? Think about who would be in your cabinet if he were to be gone tomorrow. Would you keep everybody? Would you keep a few people? Who would the new people be? Think all the time and update your thinking on a regular basis. I knew it was good advice and I took it. Those journals I can't share them with you because they're in the Historical Society, saved for a while. I don't have to live with them in my own old age. But they will be available to historians. But the point is that the number one job of a person in a number two position is to be ready to be number one. And I believe that both Peggy Flanagan and Kamala Harris have done just that. And I think the way that the campaign is running, even though this is not a political event, I think that I can say without hesitation that Kamala Harris has prepared well in her way, however she's done it. And for those of people who have complained that she hasn't had enough visibility, her job was not to have visibility. Her job has been to be prepared, and she is demonstrating that she has been. During these first few weeks of sharing my book and realizing that I've had such an eclectic variety of experiences, I've thought again about an anthropologist who some of you will know. She was the daughter of Margaret Mead, Catherine Bateson, depending on your point of view. She wrote a book in the 80s called Composing a Life, in which she says that very few women at that point in time, and perhaps even today, have the opportunity to have a linear career. There are a few, but most of us don't. Most of us compose a life from a range of experiences that come our way or that we create for ourselves. And ever since I heard her share that point of view and I read that book in the early 80s, I have reflected on that for myself, and I know that composing a life for me, has been just about the most rewarding way to spend one's time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.